is day 9 of Arthurian April, and today we're going to get a little philosophic. So I asked my followers on Blue Sky and Threads to see if anyone had any particular questions for Arthurian April that I could answer, and one came up a couple of times, and that was whether or not I believe King Arthur was a real person or not. Now, I thought about this for a little bit. I think when I was young, I definitely loved the idea of someone having existed, being King Arthur, and spawning this myth. But the more that I learned about the history and the real sort of inception point of King Arthur and the actual context of Rome leaving Britain and this sort of power vacuum, the more that I realized it didn't really matter. As I've made mention in a couple of my posts before, one of the things that I find the most fascinating about especially early medieval literature is that you're really seeing the sort of crawling from the oral tradition into this written, semi-canonized work in this quasi-history. And King Arthur as a concept is really primed for this time as well, because we're leaving the Roman Celtic past and going into this new age of Christianity, Christianization, to some extent, colonialization in terms of thought for sure, and trying to really fill that space between what happened in Britain when the Romans left and when they kind of became the more coherent group of people, and the Anglo-Saxons were sort of the predominant group. Because ultimately, I don't really think that it matters if King Arthur was real or not. King Arthur certainly didn't exist. There was likely an actual warrior named Arcturus, which we have seen in the 6th century, but whether or not that person was the actual one that translated later into what we know as King Arthur, we really can't know. Books were so scarce, and if people were telling the story orally over time, who knows what it could have been like from the beginning. But the myths that countries and peoples and cultures tell themselves about who they are is very telling about how they see themselves in the present, in the past, and the future. And of course, with King Arthur, we have the whole, he's taken off to Avalon after being wounded at Camlan, and the plan is that he's going to come back when he's feeling better and be the once and future king that we're looking for. That is immensely close to the story of Jesus, right? Of Christ dying, ascending to heaven, and then promising to return in the future to take his followers to heaven for their eternal salvation. Now, in addition to studying Arthurian legend, I also studied a lot of hagiography, and these are the stories of the saints as they develop over time, and it's very parallel. It's very interesting because you see these sort of holy people come out of figures of Celtic and pre-Christian beliefs and religions and literally be morphed into something that becomes a Christian fact, right? The saints being real. And in some ways, I guess I feel like King Arthur is no different than how we view these saints. And it's more about the lessons and the stories behind them than it is necessarily about actual historical accuracy. Because let's face it, history is inaccurate as hell. I mean, depending on who's telling the story, depending on when it was written down, depending on who translated or annotated or everything, our own idea that there is a one true historical past is incredibly flawed and kind of dangerous. I think we need to ask questions. And although the matter of Britain depends on Arthur being king and all of these things being set in motion, ultimately, it's not really about him anyway. He's there. He does the things that you expect him to do, but 80% of the stories have nothing to do with Arthur other than he's the sort of center point, the middle of that wheel, kind of like the wheel of fate. All the other stories, all the other knights and ladies and questing beasts and all of that exist because he exists. It's a way to coalesce a cultural mythology in a way that I think is pretty wonderful. It's also surprisingly diverse and eclectic. We have Muslim knights, we have knights of color, we have knights that are genderqueer or potentially trans. We have women doing incredibly powerful things. We have elderly people doing powerful things. There's all kinds of fascinating conversations, even in the early texts, about violence and love and loyalty and honor. And I think those are mostly pretty amazing things. And of course, it's just as French as it is English, and it extends beyond there. We know that the myths got all the way across the sea and have been told and retold thousands upon thousands of times. So when it comes down to it, it doesn't matter if Arthur was real. His impact is real. And that's where the magic is. That's where the whole reason that I'm a writer exists, because I'm not a terribly religious person, but there is something absolutely magic, ethereal, spiritual about being connected to these larger narratives. They're not always used for good. You can do a little bit of research on Percival and see how fascists can take these stories for their good. But most of the time with King Arthur, there's been such a fascinating progression of continued inclusivity and mythological growth that is pretty much unlike anything else out there. If you have any topics you'd like me to discuss this month, let me know. I'm going to be traveling in Europe next week, so it's going to be a little bit interesting and the background will be different, but I'd love to hear your questions.